Hi, and welcome back to Prog Will Find a Way, your friendly neighborhood progcast. I'm Jonathan Block.
And I'm Jay Valade.
And our episode on 80s prog turned out to be a little longer than we expected. There's a lot in there, and I still feel like we barely scratched the surface.
Right.
So we've broken up the episode into two, and here's part two.
Take it away. Right? All these bands changed over the course of time a bit, and they tightened up their sounds, and they shed some of their influences as they went along. But as I said, I didn't get into Marillion until Misplaced Childhood.
Okay.
And then I went backwards, right?
Yeah.
But, and even then I was not jumping in like crazy, having to get every single thing I ever saw of them, because when I start liking a band, I will go all in. I mean, but
Yeah, of course.
So I was listening to XTC and they, even though again not a prog band, but they've got pieces that verge on some of that, particularly once they stopped touring and whatnot.
And you think the pre-streaming days, right, where everything's at our fingertips now? It was not by any stretch of the imagination then. And that influenced, like, what am I going to listen to? What am I going to spend my money on? And if you got into something, it was like, okay, that's where I'm at right now for the month or 2 months or whatever, however long it goes on. And that's all you do. And then you start wishing too. At least I think back to the 80s, and it was always like, oh my God, this album has a song that's 10 minutes long, or this person is doing 10. Like, I think about somebody like Peter Hamill, so Van de Graaff Generator, pretty much the only prog band that survived punk, only because the people they kind of were always off the wall anyways.
Yeah.
But so his solo career and shorter songs, and then all of a sudden you see a 10-minute song, you're like, oh, what's it going to be?
It's going to be really good.
Hopefully it's not just repeating the chorus for 5 minutes. But it was a bit of a wilderness then, because everything just felt like it was. Even Emerson, Lake and Palmer was like, oh my God, you get to see Keith Emerson and Greg Lake on the stage again.
Yeah.
But it was still. It wasn't the same. I remember thinking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, Tarkus, it's cool, but it's just not the same. And it was even then that it was like, like you, I was more into the music of the day. And it just felt like, as a person, like a kid, they're in their 30s, and it's like, it's just starting to feel a little old. And like, I also got to tell you, like, so I played in bands then too. And I wasn't like looking for a prog band, although there were some bands I was in where we would play some prog songs, but it was more,
stretching out
a little bit, and like stuff like Peter Gabriel, Talking Heads, stuff that you could say is part of a continuum or an offshoot, and we'll talk more about Peter Gabriel in a upcoming episode. but yeah, and also to your point, the bands all started sounding very similar, and if you're not sitting there looking at the name and look away, you'll be like, which band is this? But yeah, I think as the decade went on, they got tighter. And then when we do an episode on the 90s, some of those bands, that's where they actually have their masterpieces. It's in the 90s, and for a lot of bands. But I think it was, it's like, punk didn't kill prog. It was like those
Prog
guys
killed prog.
Prog killed prog. Those guys
but then
were running
prog
out
found
of
a way.
It did, yes, like as it always does. But it was an interesting decade because there was just so much music and so much different music. And I mean, it was a Live Aid. It wasn't like a parade of prog bands or anything.
No, it was not.
You got like Ultravox was prog. That kind of stuff.
Well, and then you had playing on the we're getting into the mid 80s, but Trevor Horn doing all his stuff which was a lot of it was like polished pop, fantastic sounding, but it wasn't necessarily proggy. Right. But you listen to Welcome to the Pleasure Dome by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and that one track of the opening track was it's incredible. I love that. Yeah. I really love it. And, but like Steve Howe's on that.
I know. Well, or and it's funny because now I think about it, it's kind of come full circle. So I was always a fan of Spandau Ballet.
Okay.
And the early stuff is very, it's I mean, we're not, Prog kind of begot synth pop and that stuff too, right? And that coming from the Eno era and the ambient and the electronic, the Tangerine Dream and the Kraftwerk and that kind of angle of Prog. And then that all became something because, like, think of Thomas Dolby's albums. I mean, those are they're fantastic. Those are, very Prog, but Spandau Ballet.
But that's kind of what I was listening to. So that when I heard Asia, I was like,
Right.
I was so hopeful that Asia was going to be this fantastic thing. And,
that's
they got
why we all loved, what was the song? It was like, I would listen, all of a sudden it was like Wildest Dreams. Wildest Dreams with the
or
drums.
Time Again.
Yes, and it's like, but Wildest Dreams, it's like, oh my God, because it's done, they're doing something proggy. And I remember thinking
Time
too.
Again. Time Again was my favorite.
But I remember thinking, like, this is it? Like, this is what it's become. Even then, like, it was that. I remember thinking that too. I was like, oh, so
when I heard
darn
Thomas
it.
Dolby, I was like, oh, you opened the Pirate Twins. Holy shit, this is a great song.
Yeah, and like when I Spandau Ballet, their album Diamond, the second side is like a Prog like suite.
Okay, I'm not as familiar.
But but the point being that is that it kind of it still went out to these people. And even though the big acts, I mean, we didn't talk about Roxy Music. They had their biggest albums in that era too.
Personally, my favorite Roxy Music album, even though it is, I love that album.
Yes, very, very good album.
I love that album.
Yeah.
But it's totally different than 1973 Roxy Music.
Yes,
right? Which
it's
is good,
not
though.
Virginia Plain, that's for sure. Yes,
which is good because if it was the same thing over and over and over, that's why they did it.
No, we wanted them to do their old stuff later.
Right when we were listening.
Yes, that's when we do. What is it? 2010 Prog. That's when we get into the. Why are you doing an album that's everybody's return to form? But in the 80s, they were all trying to get as far away from it as possible. Or I guess some of them are to stay relevant, right? That's really what it was. That's their, that's their job.
That is their job. And a lot of people put these bands down for cashing in. But if they didn't, you would not be talking.
Everybody, even people that have stuff on the radio, that doesn't mean that they're, raking in the money. You don't know what kind of deals they have. So a lot of people, that's their job and they can't stop. That's why a lot of people continue to tour way past their sell-by date because they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
That's how they make their money. But yeah, the UK Prog was interesting because there really wasn't over here, which is funny because we got disco and then they're doing punk over there, but then it kind of flipped. It's like they cross-pollinate. It's like we people switched partners because then it was like, the more harder edge new wave in the New York music scene and all that. But then over there it was getting wimpier.
Yeah, and I think that I don't know. I'm not as well versed in the punk scene over there, but sometimes I think that it was a music paper fabrication just to push back against what was happening and create this new thing. I don't know that when that was happening at the time that it was selling the most albums of anybody else. It was just this is the new thing and we are embracing it and we're going to put it on the cover of the NME and you're gonna start liking it. But then by the time the 80s came around, that was, the new romantics and the new wave and the whole thing was such a different approach than punk was, but it was also a little DIY that they were doing. I mean, you had these synthesizer bands that didn't know how to do anything.
Yeah.
But they just found these sounds and they were like, we'll create these landscapes and create this music and put a beat to it and a Linn drum machine and whatever. And it became really interesting music, at least as far as I was concerned.
Well, and we've been talking about the way that the prog bands changed and kind of with the times and evolved. But it's funny because the punk did the same exact thing. I mean, you think of, Sex Pistol, Johnny Lydon became Pill. I mean, and Keith Levine, and I mean, singing the praises of Fripp and all that. It's funny how those influences kind of came back in, or The Clash, another great example. And to your point too about it was more of a media fabrication because Joe Strummer was doing like pub rock, which was the same thing. It was just 3 chords,
Yeah.
but it was and I can't remember. There's like a great Joe Strummer quote about, the pub, it was the same kind of music, but, it was delivered differently because for one, it was for drunks and for the other was for something else. But then, you have the Clash with Sandinista and all that was just like this total melange of music. And then I don't know if you ever saw it. There was this great and famous interview where it's Fripp and Joe Strummer. The Fripp and Joe Strummer interview in Musician magazine. It was either 1980 or 81, but it's just fantastic.
It's probably in the basement.
Yeah, I'm sure it's good. No, it's in the archive. It's in Jay's archive.
I don't know, but those bands, we're digressing off the Prog thing,
as we always do.
Like the Clash, became a huge band in 1982 or what, Rock the Casbah.
Oh my God,
big hit single.
Yeah, Combat
totally
Rock.
not.
Yeah. Should I stay or should I go?
Sounding like the punky
initial still punk snarl in the voice.
Snarl is fine,
very soft around the edges for Middle America.
Right. But I don't know if that was on purpose or if that was just where their songwriting and their playing was going.
Well,
they were learning to play more.
I think they were better,
and this is what we came up with.
I think that's what they did because Sandinista was like, that wasn't gonna. Even though did very well. It was Critic's Darling. It was a great album, but it was all over the map. So when I heard that, I was like, okay, these guys want to try to do something different,
which is good.
And they had their fun. They had their
which is just getting back to our. That was the interesting new kind of sounding stuff in the early 80s to us versus the neo-prog kind of, because you'd read about them in the music. I would go to the local record store and pick up Melody Maker or whatever and read about them, but nothing ever made me want to go out and buy their albums at that time because when you're reading about it and they're like, a Genesis retread, I'm like, well, I'm not spending $15 on an import record when I can get something else that I know that I'm going to like.
Yep.
Because there was no outlet for us to hear it. So
no, there wasn't. And I would buy some of the stuff and be like, oh, this is good. And then, but at the end of the day, I'd be like, but if I feel like hearing Genesis, I'll hear Genesis.
Right.
And it was just a little stronger opinions back then. But I'll be honest, I even felt that way about Marillion. I mean, I saw Marillion on their first U.S. tours. They played Toad's Place. I don't think it was 81. It had to be 82 and definitely early 83. And it was very cool. And it was like, wow. But it at the same time, it was like at that age, 16, 15, 16, I'm like, you chicks aren't going to like this music. How much can I get into this? You know what I mean? I'm like, but you said something when you were talking about the Clash that really stuck out with me, which is this is the way I'm just kind of not reinterpreting what you said, but it sparked something in me, which is like, in a lot of those bands and everything we're talking about, it's like the complexity of composition and playing stayed. It didn't go away from the prog era. What went away was like the over the top virtuoso soloing going over that they did. But that underneath stuff, that bed of stuff that the soloing, that really never went away. Bands just started applying that differently, even in a minimalistic fashion, because I always think of Ultravox and that whole, which is just so, and then you think of Cross Pollination, you think of somebody like Bill Nelson that was always straddling, Bebop Deluxe was kind of prog, but kind of punk, but kind of this. And then he went totally into that, but Ultravox always seemed very prog to me. It's something like Vienna, which is so minimalistic. But to me, that is where prog went, just like we won't talk much about it, but a lot of the Peter Gabriel stuff kind of, he was almost the prog person. He and Eno and Fripp to a certain extent and Bowie, that little crowd were they were the first ones to be like, yeah, okay. And just this is what we want to do now.
But then in that whole group of people, there's Japan and David Sylvian too.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up because there is a more global aspect to a lot of this than just the US and Canada, because we talk a lot about Russia and the UK. But yeah, and I know the band Japan is not from Japan. but I'm thinking of Yellow Magic Orchestra.
Right.
And because it's the same thing,
Moto
that
and
stuff,
those
what
people,
exactly. It's just all different kind of flavors.
Right.
But even during that era, which is funny too, because even during that, we talked the 73 and this and that, some of those bands were already going and doing stuff
Yeah.
that was,
They just didn't come to the
right.
forefront
They didn't
until
come
later.
to the forefront, but
At
clearly
least for us.
right. Yeah. As that prog movement was, as the media was bearing it, there was still, even if it was small, there was still an audience, and there were still people that were like, we're not ready to be done with this particular form of music yet.
Right. And I know we're concentrating more on the early 80s, but Sylvian, I thought, did one of my favorite albums is the Secrets of the Beehive.
Yeah.
From, it's like 87, I think, something like that. I just thought the sound on that was fantastic.
Like you said before, I mean, Japan and all that stuff, it felt at the time like this,
I had a harder time when I heard Japan for the first time earlier. I was like, I don't know if this really floats my boat.
Yeah.
But by the time Sylvian did his solo work, I liked that more.
Yeah.
But then, I went back, but some of it's.
I made a conscious decision. So before I went to college, like that summer between high school and college, I was like, I'm going to shed some of this proggy stuff, and I got to get into the music of the day. I'd already heavily into Talking Heads and stuff like that. And I remember going to a record store and tell them, this is what I've been into, but I need to broaden my horizons, and I want to do that. And Japan was one of the albums. Spandau Ballet was one of the albums. There was like 3 or 4 others too. Maybe there was Human League, but not like an early Human League or something, and it was like that'll give you a good cross section of where your head should be at, and I remember listening to those and I was like, wow, they were cool. And then I felt like, I can see how it is a progression. Like this is the, it's funny. You can't say I'm into progressive music and progressive rock, but it can't progress.
Right. Exactly. But I think a lot of that, the germ of some of that was happening in those early 80s songs and albums, right? In the 82, 81, 82, 83. But then a lot of those bands either kept going into like deeper and darker territories, or more minimalistic. Like Talk is a perfect example of that, right?
Yeah.
Or they went more poppy, like OMD went from more experimental synth music to getting horns and fun in its own way, but a little less progressive. Yeah, they became less progressive as they went, versus some of them became even more progressive. But the Talk being the poster child of that.
Yeah. Well, all right. I feel like we've been going on for a while here.
Right.
So we just kind of scratched the surface here, because I just all of a sudden I'm like, we didn't say a word about the Police. I mean, there's so many bands that had, very progressive kind of albums, and you can't cover them all. And I think we talked about neo-prog.
we scratched the surface there, but that was mainly because it was not on my radar. Right. And listening back to it, I can kind of see why it wasn't.
Yeah.
I think it's when those bands kind of matured and integrated those sounds into their own sound that they became themselves. So
and I think we'll have more to say about certainly a number of those bands when we talk about the 90s.
Yeah.
But until then, Prog will find a way.
As we found that to be the case in the 80s.
But you have to want to.
Yeah, you have to want it.